The sun blazed down on the city, the heat shimmering off the pavement as people bustled through the streets. 12-year-old Jamal Carter stood at the entrance of Lincoln Park, gripping a small cooler filled with bottled water. He wiped sweat from his forehead, adjusting the handwritten sign taped to the front. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe because what you're about to witness is a story that will leave you speechless. Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest consequences, and today, one phone call is about to change lives forever. Cold water, $1. It wasn't much, but to Jamal it meant everything. He wasn't just selling water, he was chasing a dream. His mom worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and his little sister's birthday was coming up. He wanted to buy her something special, something she'd remember. But money was tight, and this was his way of making it happen. People walked past, some buying a bottle, some ignoring him completely. But Jamal didn't let that bother him. He was determined. What he didn't notice, however, was a pair of angry eyes watching him from a high-rise apartment across the street. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, an elderly white woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of entitlement, peered out from her balcony, shaking her head in disapproval. She took a sip of her iced tea, glaring at the young boy. To her, he was a nuisance, a disturbance, a child who didn't belong in her neighborhood. She had lived in this upscale apartment for over 20 years, and she prided herself on keeping things in order. And to Mrs. Henderson, a young black boy selling water on the sidewalk was the definition of disorder. Grumbling under her breath, she reached for her phone. 911. The moment the operator answered, she didn't hesitate. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual outside the park. The words rolled off her tongue effortlessly, like she had done this before. He's loitering, soliciting money. I don't know what he's up to, but it doesn't look good. On the other end, the dispatcher hesitated. Ma'am, is he causing harm? Mrs. Henderson scoffed. He's making people uncomfortable. That should be enough, don't you think? The dispatcher sighed but dispatched a patrol unit. As Mrs. Henderson hung up, she smiled smugly, taking another sip of her tea. Let's see how long you last now, she muttered under her breath. Down below, Jamal was completely unaware of what was coming. He had just handed a bottle to a kind older man who gave him a $5 bill and told him to keep the change. He grinned, tucking the money into his pocket. But just as he turned back to his cooler, a shadow fell over him. A police cruiser had pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable as they approached. The world around Jamal seemed to slow down. The murmurs of people around him, the cars passing by, it all faded into the background. He had done nothing wrong. So why did it suddenly feel like he was in trouble? The sun hung heavy in the sky, beating down on the pavement as Jamal stared up at the 2 officers approaching him. His hands instinctively clenched the cooler handle, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just selling water, trying to make a little money. Yet, the looks on their faces told him that they didn't see it that way. Hey, kid, one of the officers said, adjusting his belt. His badge gleamed in the sunlight. You got a permit for this? Jamal blinked. A permit? The other officer, a tall, heavy-set man with a stern expression, crossed his arms. You can't sell stuff on the sidewalk without a permit. City ordinance. Jamal's heart pounded. He didn't know anything about permits. He was just a kid trying to make an honest dollar. I didn't know, he said quietly, glancing at the crowd that had started gathering. People were watching. Some had their phones out, recording. From her balcony, Mrs. Henderson smirked, satisfied. I'm just trying to make some money, Jamal continued. I'm not bothering anybody. The first officer sighed. That's not the point, kid. You need to pack it up. Now. Jamal hesitated. His little sister's birthday was in 3 days. He had barely made anything yet. He swallowed hard. But, did you hear what we said? The second officer snapped, taking a step closer. Pack it up. Jamal's breath hitched. He wasn't resisting, but suddenly he felt small. He had seen enough news to know how situations like this could go. The crowd murmured. A woman's voice called out, "He's just a kid. Leave him alone." Another person, a man in a business suit, shook his head. "You serious? Overselling water?" The first officer shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the weight of the cameras on him now. The world had changed. People didn't just look away anymore. They recorded. They shared. But before anyone could say another word, the sound of a car door slamming shut cut through the air. A sleek, black SUV had pulled up at the curb, and a tall, well-dressed man stepped out. The way he moved, the confidence in his stride, it commanded attention. Even the officers turned toward him. Jamal's eyes widened. He recognized this man. Everybody did. Anthony Rivers, the billionaire entrepreneur, the CEO of Rivers Enterprises, the man who had built his empire from the ground up. And right now he was walking straight toward them. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Mrs. Henderson, still watching from her balcony, narrowed her eyes. What was he doing here? Anthony stopped beside Jamal, looking down at him for a moment before turning his piercing gaze to the officers. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. The first officer hesitated. Sir, this boy is selling without a permit. It's against city regulations." Anthony nodded slowly, as if processing the information. Then he turned back to Jamal. "You trying to make some money, kid?" Jamal nodded hesitantly. "For what?" Jamal swallowed. "My little sister's birthday. I wanted to get her something nice." Anthony's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered to the officers. "So, let me get this straight." He gestured toward Jamal. "This boy is out here working. Not stealing. Not causing trouble. Just working. And y'all showed up for what? To shut him down." The officers shifted, glancing at each other. The second officer cleared his throat. "It's the law, sir." Anthony let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "The law." He repeated the words like they tasted bitter. He exhaled sharply, looking down at Jamal again. "How much for your whole cooler?" Jamal's eyes widened. "What?" Anthony pulled out his wallet, flipping through crisp $100 bills. "I'm buying everything you've got." Jamal could barely breathe. "It's $1 a bottle," he said, voice almost shaking. Anthony handed him a stack of bills. "Here's 5,000. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The officers looked stunned. Jamal's hands trembled as he took the money. He had never seen so much cash in his life. Anthony turned back to the officers, his expression darkening. "This boy doesn't need to be shut down. He needs to be supported." Then, he lifted his gaze to the apartment building across the street. To Mrs. Henderson's balcony. Her smirk was gone. Anthony's voice carried across the street. "I wonder how the property owner of this building feels about harassing young entrepreneurs." The crowd turned. Mrs. Henderson stiffened. Anthony smiled. "I guess I'll find out," he said. Because what nobody knew yet, what Mrs. Henderson was about to find out, was that Anthony Rivers wasn't just a billionaire. He was about to become her new landlord. Mrs. Henderson felt her stomach drop as Anthony Rivers' gaze locked onto her balcony. The smirk she had worn just moments ago had vanished, replaced by something colder: uncertainty. The crowd had turned their attention to her now, whispering, judging. She had spent years controlling what happened in this neighborhood, making calls, pushing people out when they didn't fit her vision of respectable residents. But never, not once, had she felt the weight of her actions like she did now. Anthony didn't linger. He turned back to Jamal, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You good, kid?" Jamal nodded, still clutching the thick stack of bills, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The officers, sensing that the situation had shifted far beyond their control, mumbled something about just following orders before stepping away, pretending to be preoccupied with their radios. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. As the police cruiser pulled away, the tension in the air slowly unraveled. The crowd, once unsure of what to do, erupted into applause. Cheers rang out, strangers patting Jamal on the back, congratulating him. "Keep hustling, young man," someone called out. "Don't let nobody stop you," shouted another. Jamal's heart swelled, but as grateful as he was for the support, his mind was still racing. $5,000. More money than he had ever held in his life. And Anthony Rivers, one of the most powerful men in the city, had just stood up for him like it was nothing. "Thank you," Jamal finally managed to say, looking up at him. Anthony studied him for a second before nodding. "You remind me of myself at your age." Jamal blinked. "You sold water too?" Anthony chuckled. "Not exactly, but I know what it's like to grind for something when nobody hands it to you. To be underestimated." His expression darkened slightly. "And I know what it's like to have people try to stop you just because they can." His words hung in the air. Jamal understood exactly what he meant. Anthony turned to the cooler. "You done for the day?" Jamal hesitated. I guess so." Anthony glanced back at the apartment building, at the window where Mrs. Henderson had disappeared. "Good, because we have somewhere to be." Jamal frowned. "Where?" Anthony smirked. "Ever been inside a penthouse before?" Jamal's eyes widened. "No way." Anthony pulled his keys from his pocket. "Then hop in. We've got a meeting to attend." Mrs. Henderson sat stiffly in her living room, staring out the window as the crowd outside slowly dispersed. The taste of victory had turned sour in her mouth. She had won these little battles before. Made a call, gotten rid of the undesirables, and moved on. But this was different. She had poked the wrong bear. A knock on her door made her jolt. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Still, when she swung the door open and found Anthony Rivers standing there, Jamal by his side, her throat tightened. "May I come in?" Anthony asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a request. Mrs. Henderson straightened, trying to mask her unease. "I don't see what there is to discuss." Anthony lifted a brow. "Oh, I think you do." She pursed her lips but stepped aside. The moment they entered, Jamal's mouth nearly dropped open. The place was massive, high ceilings, gold-trimmed furniture, expensive paintings. Everything about it screamed wealth. But something about the way Mrs. Henderson held herself, the way she clutched the silk fabric of her blouse, told Jamal that all this money hadn't made her happy. Anthony didn't sit. He simply stood in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, looking around as if he had already claimed the space. "You like living here?" he asked casually. Mrs. Henderson narrowed her eyes. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that leads to an interesting answer," Anthony said, giving her a slow, knowing smile. Mrs. Henderson folded her arms. "If you're here to lecture me, don't bother. I did what I thought was best for the neighborhood." Anthony let out a small laugh. "Best for the neighborhood? Or best for you?" Mrs. Henderson's face twitched. "This is a respectable building. I won't have it turning into—" She stopped herself, but Anthony caught it. "Turning into what?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Mrs. Henderson's jaw locked. Jamal, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "Do you even know what I was selling water for?" Mrs. Henderson didn't respond. Jamal stepped forward, standing a little taller. "It wasn't for me. It was for my sister's birthday, so I could buy her a gift." Something flickered in Mrs. Henderson's expression, something she quickly buried. Anthony tilted his head. "And that's the kid you felt threatened by?" Silence. Then Anthony pulled something from his coat pocket and placed it on the glass coffee table. A thick, leather-bound folder. Mrs. Henderson frowned. "What's that?" Anthony smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The paperwork that says I now own this building." Mrs. Henderson's breath hitched. You what?" Anthony gestured around. "This entire complex? Bought it out this morning." He leaned in slightly. "Which means you're standing in my building." Mrs. Henderson's knees nearly buckled. Anthony picked up the folder and held it out to her. "I want you to read this carefully," he said. "Because your name? It's on the list of tenants who will have to reapply for residency under my new policies." Mrs. Henderson snatched the folder and flipped through the pages. Her face paled. This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "Oh, I can," Anthony interrupted. And I have. Jamal looked up at him, eyes wide. He had never seen someone so effortlessly turn the tables before. It was like watching a king reclaim his throne. Mrs. Henderson clenched the folder, her hands shaking. I've lived here for 20 years. Anthony shrugged. And that little boy out there was standing on the sidewalk for 20 minutes before you called the cops on him. Silence stretched between them. Jamal thought he saw something in Mrs. Henderson's expression, regret, maybe, shame, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came. Anthony took a step back. You wanted control over this place. Well, now you have none. He glanced at his watch. You've got 30 days to decide if you're staying or going. Mrs. Henderson's lips parted, but no words came out. Anthony turned to Jamal. Come on, kid. Let's go. As they walked out the door, Jamal didn't look back. But Mrs. Henderson did. She looked around her lavish apartment, at the paintings, the furniture, the place she had once ruled over with silent authority. For the first time in decades, she felt powerless. Mrs. Henderson sat motionless in her lavish apartment, staring blankly at the documents Anthony had left behind. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the folder, her carefully maintained world crumbling around her. For decades, she had called the shots in this building. She was the unspoken authority, the gatekeeper of respectability. But now, with a single signature, Anthony Rivers had taken it all away. She slammed the folder shut, her chest tightening. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent years ensuring that people like Anthony, like Jamal, would never have a say in what happened here. And yet, here she was, powerless. Outside, Jamal followed Anthony to the sleek black car parked at the curb, still struggling to process everything. You really own that whole building? He asked, glancing back at the towering complex. Anthony smirked. I do now. Jamal shook his head in disbelief. But why? Just 'cause she called the cops. Anthony's expression darkened slightly. No, because people like her think they can control everything, that they can push people down and get away with it. He exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. I've dealt with Mrs. Henderson before. Years ago. Jamal looked at him curiously. What happened? Anthony tapped the wheel, his jaw tightening. I was about your age when I lived in that building. Jamal's eyebrows shot up. Wait, what? Anthony nodded. My mom rented one of those apartments. Worked 2 jobs to afford it. But Henderson didn't like us. Kept raising the rent, finding reasons to harass my mother. Until one day, she sent a notice saying we had 30 days to leave. Jamal swallowed. So, she kicked you out? Anthony's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. Pretty much. He let out a small, bitter chuckle. We had nowhere to go. Bounced between motels. Slept in the car a few times. It took years before we got back on our feet. Jamal stared at him, speechless. He had assumed Anthony was just another rich guy, someone who had always had money. But now he saw something else in him. He saw himself. So, you bought the place just to get back at her? Jamal asked. Anthony shook his head. No, kid. I bought it so no one else has to go through what I did. He glanced down at Jamal. Including you. Jamal's chest tightened. No one had ever looked out for him like this before. Come on, Anthony said, nodding toward the car. We've got somewhere to be. Mrs. Henderson paced her apartment, dialing number after number. Frank, I need you to tell me this sale isn't final. She snapped into the phone. There has to be a loophole. Some way to reverse it. A long pause. No. Her lawyer finally responded. It's airtight. He bought out the owners fair and square. Legally, he can do whatever he wants with the building. Mrs. Henderson's throat tightened. There must be something I can do. Not unless you have a few $1 million lying around to buy it back. Silence. Mrs. Henderson slowly sank into her chair. This can't be happening, she whispered. But it was. She had spent years keeping people like Anthony out, making sure only the right kind of tenants stayed in her building. And now, the very person she had tried to push away was the one deciding her future. A soft knock at her door made her heart skip. She already knew who it was. Taking a slow breath, She rose from her seat and opened the door. Anthony stood there, hands in his pockets, looking entirely at ease. Beside him stood Jamal. Mrs. Henderson stiffened. "What do you want now?" Anthony studied her for a moment before stepping inside. "I wanted to see what kind of woman you really are." Mrs. Henderson frowned. "Excuse me?" Anthony leaned against the wall, his voice calm but firm. "You've spent years making people's lives harder, pushing people out just because they didn't fit your idea of who belongs here." Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "I was protecting this building, keeping it respectable." Anthony's lips pressed into a thin line. "Respectable? You called the cops on a kid selling water. A kid trying to do something good." He shook his head. "That's not protecting anything. That's just control." Mrs. Henderson's face darkened. "So what now? You came here to rub it in?" Anthony exhaled. "No. I came here to give you a choice." She crossed her arms. "What kind of choice?" Anthony reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to her. She opened it hesitantly and froze. It was a renewal application. Her hands shook as she read the fine print. "If you want to stay here," Anthony said, watching her reaction, "you'll have to follow the same rules as everyone else." Mrs. Henderson's head snapped up. "You expect me to just live by the same standards you held everyone else to?" Anthony interrupted. "Yeah, I do." Mrs. Henderson clenched the paper. "Why would you even offer me this?" Anthony's jaw tightened slightly. "Because I know what it's like to lose a home." For the first time, something flickered in Mrs. Henderson's expression. Something she hadn't shown in years. Doubt, maybe even guilt. Jamal, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "You can't control everything forever." Mrs. Henderson turned toward him, and for a moment, she saw not just a boy, but a reflection of the past, of all the people she had turned away, of all the lives she had disrupted. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she had been right. She looked back at the renewal application in her hands, her mind racing. This was her chance to stay. But it came with a cost. Was she willing to pay it? Mrs. Henderson sat in silence, gripping the renewal application with trembling hands. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control. Anthony watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Jamal stood with his arms crossed, waiting for her response. The old woman's lips tightened as she glanced down at the paper again. It was all there. The same rules she had enforced on others now applied to her. Rent regulations. No unfair evictions. Equal treatment for all tenants. She was being given a chance. A chance to stay in the building she had ruled over for decades. But accepting it meant accepting defeat. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to lash out, to tell Anthony Rivers to take his offer and shove it. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had lost. And for the first time, she had to live by the rules she had spent a lifetime bending. Mrs. Henderson exhaled sharply and placed the application on the table. Her wrinkled fingers smoothed over the paper, her thoughts a tangled mess. Then, slowly, she looked up at Anthony. "I'll think about it," she muttered. Anthony nodded. He wasn't expecting a thank you. He wasn't expecting anything. "You have a week," he said simply. With that, he turned toward the door, motioning for Jamal to follow. The boy hesitated for a moment, then looked back at Mrs. Henderson. He saw the stiffness in her posture, the tightness in her jaw. But he also saw something else. Uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. Jamal didn't say a word. He just gave her one last look, then stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him. The air outside was crisp, the city buzzing with life as Anthony and Jamal walked down the street. Jamal kicked at a loose pebble on the sidewalk, his thoughts racing. "You really think she's gonna stay?" Anthony exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Doesn't matter." Jamal frowned. "How can it not matter?" Anthony stopped walking and turned to face him. "Because it was never about her." Jamal blinked, confused. "Then what was it about?" Anthony gave him a knowing look. "You." Jamal's eyes widened slightly. Anthony continued. You could have walked away when she called the cops. Could have let that moment define you. But you didn't. He smirked. You stood your ground. And because of that, everything changed. Jamal's heart pounded. He had never thought of it like that. So what now? He asked. Anthony looked around at the city, his gaze distant. Now? We keep moving forward. Jamal nodded, taking it all in. His world had changed in ways he never expected. A week ago, he was just a kid selling water, trying to make a few bucks. Now, he was standing beside a man who had once been in his shoes, who had fought his way to the top and turned around to help the next kid in line. Jamal clenched his fists, determination flooding his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was rising. And nothing. Asterisk asterisk, not Mrs. Henderson, not the cops, not the world itself. Asterisk asterisk was going to stop him. A week later, in apartment 4B, Mrs. Henderson sat by her window, staring at the renewal application. Her name was already signed at the bottom. She had made her choice. But as she looked out at the street below, watching Jamal laughing with a group of kids, watching Anthony step into a meeting with a business partner, she realized something. This wasn't her building anymore. It never really had been. She set the paper down and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel in control. And for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't sure if that was such a bad thing. The end.